Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. I am sort of in end-of-the-world burnout mode, so rather than prattling on about my whole thing, let's just dive into this week's show, shall we? So my guest this time is Mark Prins, who has a debut novel that I loved. It is called The Latinist, and it's published by W.W. Norton. The Latinist is about a classics PhD candidate at Oxford who discovers that her advisor has submarined her job prospects with a passive-aggressive letter of reference, seemingly to keep her, Tessa, around Oxford for another year. The novel gets into the power dynamics of their relationship, and it does it through the prism of their field of scholarship, which might sound dry, but trust me, it's absolutely riveting and illuminating. For example, the candidate, Tessa, she's an American, by the way. She's finished a monograph on Ovid's myth of Apollo and Daphne, the one in which the nymph Daphne, rather than submit to Apollo's lust, asks her father to save her. And he does this by transforming her into a laurel tree forever. Apollo, meanwhile, gets to carry on cavorting with no real consequences. He just doesn't get to screw Daphne. And one of the threads of the novel is Tessa's contention that when Ovid describes Apollo's feelings for Daphne as love, it should be taken as ironic, even at the time, and not truly of the heart. And this is an issue that she faces directly when trying to understand why her advisor, Chris, would sabotage her career like this and what he really wants from her. And while Tessa deals with these power dynamics, she's also at work on a paper about a lesser-known poet named Marius, who wrote in this strange choliambic meter, also known as a limping foot. Her focus on Marius and her desire to escape Chris takes her to an archaeological dig in Italy where she helps make an interesting discovery, which is, I admit, far more exciting than I make it sound here. The book, well, Mark does this fantastic job of drawing out not just the characters of Tessa and Chris, and giving Chris a real story, not just making him the villain, but he also gets at the stakes involved in their academic disputes, and not just, what it means to be in a fight in this sort of limited space, but what the actual elements are that they're fighting over. And he finds ways during that to sort of mirror and sometimes invert the myth of Daphne and Apollo in a contemporary setting where Daphne finally gets a voice and a say in how things go. And along the way, Mark creates the mystery of the poet Marius, not just through exposition, but through the poetry itself. See, Marius is a fictional creation of Mark's, and he manages to build a wonderful, consistent body of scholarship. He writes the poems himself, does them in Latin and English. He really, it's a fantastic achievement. The Latinist, it's an academic novel of sorts, but it really manages to capture what's at stake, not merely, in the realm of academia, but in terms of gender and power dynamics and who gets a voice. And and it's weird, but, I was reminded of the recent episode with Nicole Rudick and her approach to Nikki de Saint Phal, where we talked about, the notion of who's worthy of a biography. and who writes history and who decides which poems and which poets are worth transmitting through time. But again, on top of all that, The Latinist has a really tense plot with Tessa and Chris engaged in a cat and mouse, I don't want to say game, but game, even while they're each trying to come to terms, with their own lives and the metamorphoses they've each undergone in their own upbringings. I'll put it this way. It is tense enough that I was literally on the edge of my seat when a character was delivering a paper at a conference of classic scholars. Mark builds the tension so beautifully and uses exposition and action and character and brings the whole shebang together along with this fictive poet and the whole creation of a world of scholarship to create a really compelling novel. So unfortunately, I get the feeling like I'm not doing it justice here. Let me just say, The Latinist is an awfully entertaining, well-written, carefully constructed novel with really compelling characters and in a milieu that I just adore. So I'm awfully glad I came across a review of The Latinist in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago, because just on a description of the book, I thought, yeah, I need to track down the author and sit down and record with him, and I'm very glad that Mark consented to that. So here's Mark's bio. Mark Prins is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and a recipient of fellowships from the Truman Capote Literary Trust, the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, and the Sun Valley Writers Conference. He lives in Brooklyn, New York. His debut novel is The Latinist. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Mark Prins. Where'd the novel come from? And this is a horrible, so where do you get your ideas sort of thing. But tell me about the origin of your first novel.
Yeah. So are we, we're recording,
We
right?
are.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, yes, we are.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of as a writer, I wish that I could say that I was more of an architect who sort of just decides what I'm going to write and then does it with the exact blueprint that I had in mind. Unfortunately, I'm not that. And oftentimes, I start writing something and I completely fail at that. But in that failure, there's like the gem of something interesting. And so, in this particular case, I was in my first year of my master's program. I did the MFA at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and I spent the whole year trying to write this novel about three young adults, like post collegiate, mid to late 20s in New York City. One of whom was sort of loosely based on me. One of whom was a Oxford classicist who had come to New York City, and the other was a ballet dancer who had lost his leg in the Boston Marathon. And this project was boring to everybody, including myself. It was just a mess. And I kind of, struggled with it my whole first year. And then in my second year, my back was kind of against the wall. I had to show something to my peers. And, I was on the verge of giving up entirely and quitting writing. And I went back through some of the things I had written the year before to see if there was anything I could harvest for, a 20, 25 page submission. And I found a few paragraphs that I had written from the point of view of this Oxford classicist dissertation advisor, him sort of looking at her in, this is someone who had sabotaged her career at that point. In this original version, she had come back to the States, but that never really happens in the novel. So I realized that this was the only thing I had written the past year that had any energy or any reason to justify its own existence. And I placed the Oxford classicist back in Oxford and wrote the, first chapter very quickly and, submitted it to my, what they call the workshop. And it struck a nerve. And I think I had discovered something with this power struggle between the head of classics at this Oxford college and his young sort of American protege that had a lot of energy. And then the rest is history. I sort of wrote the first draft of the novel pretty quickly after that.
I shudder to ask, but I know you spent a year at Oxford in your during your undergraduate days.
Yeah.
Did you ever see anything that was is this roman cloth in any sort of way, or essentially full cloth invention?
No, I mean, this was not my experience at all.
Or something you'd witnessed, but
Yeah, no, it's I mean, really it was witnessing I of course, I've had my own problems with bosses in different parts of my life. And so I'm sort of aware of, how that relationship can be fraught, and what it can feel like to sort of feel betrayed by someone who has, that sort of, who with whom you have that sort of asymmetric power dynamic. Yeah. But also like, similar examples, there's so many of them that I've witnessed with people who I care about deeply. And it was sort of the intersection of that particular power struggle with the Apollo and Daphne myth that made it really come alive for me. So yeah, but no, my Oxford experience was actually extraordinarily positive, and my experience with my professor, or they call them tutors there, was extraordinarily positive.
When you were there, had you at the time thought about writing about the era and location someday? Were you thinking about it as fictional, terrain, I guess, when you were there, or were you too in the middle of it to think in those terms?
Well, I just wasn't a writer then. I was.
Yeah, what were you?
Yeah, I didn't decide that I wanted to try to write fiction until, around when I was graduating college and sort of right after. And even then, it took me several years to accept my fate, sort of, because I was very resistant to it. So when I was there, it was only my junior year of undergrad, and I was a student of English. I was writing essays. I was a reader, but I was not a writer. I was maybe beginning to try to write fiction, but I think mostly whenever I tried to write fiction, I was mostly just stunned at how bad it was. How truly, truly horrible it was.
I never got over that myself. So that's why I do a podcast instead.
That was the major, so it was hard to even get going, because I had at that point become, a pretty good reader of fiction. And so I felt like I had, a palate to some degree, or an understanding of what was good writing, or at least a certain understanding of what was good writing. And my own writing could not be considered good writing under any subjective lens. So it was a struggle at first to get past that.
And since the book is so much about the metamorphoses, tell me about that metamorphosis for you. Yeah. What was that moment where you realized this is what you would become?
Right. Well, I can track the origins of it to, sort of a year before that, which would be like some point in my sophomore year of college. I was writing an essay about William Blake's Jerusalem, which, if you don't know, it's this pretty crazy poem, sort of nonlinear. William Blake was this. He was a poet, but he also made these incredible illuminated manuscripts. And, a lot of people would probably be familiar with some of those pretty iconic images if they were to, look him up on the internet. But he was a fantastic poet, aside from that, probably a better poet than an illustrator, actually. But Jerusalem was his, I guess his most important, or maybe his largest work. And it's, it's almost just like a compilation of voices. And the point of my essay was I was making the point that the voice of exposition in the poem was secondary to the voice of sort of dramatic, um, artistic expression, and that nothing could be truly expressed in this, poetic landscape unless it were in the voice of that dramatic character versus the expository character.
Mhm.
And the interesting thing was that I was trying to make this point in an essay, which is an expository mode of communication.
Sure.
And I found myself like the, dragon that's eating its own tail, sort of like I could not make the point that I actually wanted to make in the language, in the mode of the language that I was using. Um, and so,
But you didn't fall into David Foster Wallace territory and go completely insane trying to recreate logic systems or anything, right?
well, not logic. I did go a little bit insane. I mean, I remember, I remember ending the essay with like, I almost began to like play around with, punctuation um, and almost in like a sort of like Gertrude Stein type way. And I don't even know if my professor got that far when she was, reading the essays. It was, it was like, but it was important for me because I think that at that moment, I can trace my desire to start writing fiction or to start writing more dramatically than as opposed to in an expository manner. I can trace that to, that essay. And having said that, the problem was that I had no clue how to write fiction, and had also had no talent for it whatsoever. And so it was a long journey from there through, college and the sort of day jobs that I had for several years as I tried to write in the mornings and tried to write fiction in the mornings before work. And like slowly began to get better. And when I say get better, I mean just even be able to create a story that exists in time and space and can be read and enjoyed by, one or two people on the planet.
Mhm.
It was pretty dire. It was pretty dire in the beginning, but it was a slow climb. And yeah, that was really the metamorphosis took place like in these dark early mornings I lived in the financial district for a while, in Manhattan. I worked for IBM for 2 years. And then I was a tutor, for a couple of years in New York and then eventually got into the Iowa Writers Workshop. And I think it was mostly in my second year there when I started writing the novel that I felt comfortable to some degree being a fiction writer.
And we'll get to the novel itself, I promise, which I enjoyed the living hell out of, and I'll talk about it in the introduction. Trust me. What did you have to learn about writing a novel in that process?
About writing a novel in particular?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, I had to, I think I saw like a sort of master class about, it was for screenwriting. I was actually, because I had to teach a class on fiction writing
Mm-hmm.
and to undergraduates at the University of Iowa. And I was, looking for craft talks that I thought would be helpful. And there was actually a craft talk by Aaron Sorkin on plot and story that I found really helpful for me. And it was just about sort of character desires and obstacles. It was about desire and obstacle, and how you can have all of the cool things that one might want to happen in a story or in a novel. I mean, I've always, growing up as a child, I would think I had the best idea for a story, and all my friends and I would have the best ideas for a story. And we'd be like, wouldn't that be so cool? And then it would be like, why can't we just write this? Because we didn't understand sort of the mechanisms behind it. And, I still get approached by people today who are like, they're like, I have the best idea. Like, it's going to be the Panama Papers, but it's going to be this and that. And,
Yeah.
there are ways of course there are ways to write amazing novels that are plotless, um, but I found that actually plot kind of made sense to me, as a writer. And when I watched this video of Aaron Sorkin talking about, all the cool things you want to put into a story, you can hang like clothespins on the clothesline of your, long line of tension with character, desire, and obstacle. Um, Looking at Tessa and Chris, I felt like that made sense to me. I felt like these were two characters, both with very strong desires, and those desires were in conflict with one another. And it was so clear to me what the obstacles were. And it was also so clear to me what those obstacles and what those desires meant to them as characters. And that really helped me write the novel, because I could always come back to this sort of central desire and obstacle drive shaft. And without that, it's hard to, write a full story with an arc and everything that's, novel length for me personally.
Yeah, and I think you capture both of those perfectly and wed them to plot in a way I love. I have no idea how other people are receiving the novel, and you can tell me what some of the comments you've gotten have been. But to me, it's as a semi-classics nerd, the setting, the characters' wants and needs, and the what they're trying to solve is utterly propulsive as far as I'm concerned. I was just gripped by the book throughout. But again, I'm weird, but I've got a significant number of listeners and friends who I think are exactly in my boat. So, I plan on getting a bunch of copies to give to other people too. But we do raise the question, man writing a novel that's primarily third person narration, but primarily from a woman's point of view.
Right.
Feel intimidated? Was it I'm going to have issues doing this, or, did you feel confident in being able to channel the voice of Tessa as well as you did?
No, I mean, there were, it wasn't, it wasn't easy. I'd say that was probably the hardest part about writing the book was, writing across gender. And it was also the most rewarding part about writing the book, in many ways. And it certainly, I mean, the reader can decide for themselves whether the book is successful in, depicting Tessa's point of view or in writing across gender. But I can promise that it is more successful than it was when I first started writing Tessa's point of view.
What did you have to learn? What was wrong early on? What did you have to improve?
Well, I can tell you, it's funny because sometimes when you're facing something difficult, there are oftentimes multiple hurdles that you're trying to jump at the same time. And that makes it almost difficult to even know what the hurdles are that you're trying to clear, that you can't clear. And looking back, I mean, I have a little bit more clarity about what was, difficult in the very beginnings. But I could talk about this for literally hours. So stop me if I go on too long. But in the very beginning, one of the things that my peers pointed out, because, in the workshop environment, you're sort of putting something up every, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks or something. So I was showing this to my peers in almost real time as I was writing the first draft. And so of course it's very, very raw and unpolished, but, I was writing these sort of tense confrontation scenes between Tessa and Chris. And my peers pointed out that Tessa never really seemed physically intimidated or scared around him, even though they thought that maybe she would. And when I looked back on these scenes, I realized that, when I was imagining being in when I was writing Tessa, I was still sort of looking down on Chris, and I'm, tall. I'm personally taller than Chris. I'm over 6 feet tall. And once I just imagined looking slightly up at him, that was, it's kind of staggering how much of a difference that made just in the beginning. Like I had not yet left my own body when I was writing Tessa. And so that's like pretty basic, but like it wasn't something that I had really, really done every time I was writing a sentence from Tessa's point of view. But then that realization began to sort of waterfall into a number of other realizations. And, about the way that she would move through space, that was different from the way that I moved through space, or in the way that I was sort of socialized to move through space. And then there were other things like, every day after I would stop writing, I would go on Reddit, and I'd go to the to the subreddit Reddit Ask Women and Reddit Female Fashion Advice. And I would, because I realized that there were all of these things in Tessa's material reality that she would know and be intimately familiar with that I would not. And, at the end of the novel, for example, she's wearing these slingback shoes, and she's wearing this shell top to all of her conferences. And these details are incredibly important for actually building the material reality of the character. They're incredibly important for me too, to be able to experience that material reality. And just those details enable the character to become a little bit more alive, in terms of, that gendered sort of difference between me and her. But ultimately, it always the most important question is going to be, and in the beginning, I found myself asking my question, what would a female character do in this situation? And that's never the right question to ask. It's always, what would Tessa do in this situation? And if you feel like you have found the core of someone's character, then that is what's going to enable you to write that character regardless of what their gender is or what your gender is. All of those things about the material reality are helpful for making it real and helpful for bringing it to life. But it's, finding the core of that character, that's the most important thing. And so much of that was about deciding, not only what her deepest desires were, but also not only figuring out what those deepest desires were, but also deciding that she was the kind of person who has very strong desires, who is very ambitious, who is going to, put herself in harm's way, and even sometimes discard sometimes not treat her own personal relationships the way that she might want to, in order to, go after the things that she really cares about and really wants to achieve. And then, to have to reckon with those decisions as any normal person would. But yeah, that's the medium length version of this.
So if we were recording in person, I'm sure we would end up doing the full 3-hour, shebang about this stuff. But I'll be merciful on a remote like this. But while I hate the word problematic and everything that gets tied into that nowadays with literature, culture, etc., talk a little about the choice of giving Chris a voice, a perspective, some would say a background that muddies the waters, I suppose, where it would be too easy to have portrayed him as a simply bad person or manipulative figure. You make him much more complex.
Yeah.
Did you have you run into any trouble or any backlash over the fact that you kind of pursued that angle instead of
making him just a pure villain,
a stock villain?
Villain. Yeah. I don't know if I've run into any trouble. I mean, I have been asked the question, and I guess personally, as a reader, if I'm reading something where I sense a stock villain, I immediately want to put it down because it's not interesting to me. It doesn't feel authentic. It doesn't feel authentic to the complexities of human beings. I think people exist in shades of gray, not in shades of black and white. And I think it's not just people, but just, reality. There's so many different subjective lenses that one can place on reality. And the one that's being placed on reality that has stock villains seems to me the least interesting.
Sure.
But of course, there are truly evil people out there. It's just I think that even when there are evil people, they still exist in different. They still exist in complexity. And with Chris, Chris is not a good guy, but he's capable of doing some good things. Just like Tessa is probably a good person, but she's capable of doing some not good things. And so I guess like my decision to, have Chris be a little bit more three-dimensional was, it wasn't so much a decision. It was more like an aesthetic choice that not even an aesthetic choice. I wouldn't feel comfortable doing it any other way. But sure. I would say also that, so much of the book is inspired by Ovid. And Ovid, one of the things I find interesting about him is, how difficult it is to find a moral center in Metamorphosis.
There is a whole conversation we could have about how the things we value in modernity are not the same things they valued in antiquity. And I'm fully down with getting into that conversation a little later on. But yeah, go into what Ovid meant versus what how you metamorphosize the Metamorphoses.
Well, I just think that, aesthetically, I think like, Ovid is so subversive and so difficult to pinpoint and so playful. And I didn't want to write just a direct, straight up, you could say feminist recasting of the Daphne and Apollo myth. I did want it to preserve to some degree the sort of flavor that you get in the Metamorphoses of things being complicated and things being multifaceted and ambiguous. And difficult to locate a moral center on.
Mm-hmm. And on top of that, and beyond those creative challenges when it came to the characters, you did something that, again, to me works perfectly, but, I don't even see the seams in this respect, but the way you managed to make classics themes, mm-hmm. I would say, if I explained, the novel to my wife, who's not a classicist, she would get it. And mm-hmm. I think, get from all the background you provide and the false poet you create in the course of the novel, that it's all there, that you manage to convey what's at stake and what some of the value of, the classics and classical poetry are, and what Latin meter is like mm-hmm. in a way that, it makes me wonder that essay you brought up about Blake, the nature of exposition and fictionalization. Yeah. I mean, one of your key scenes is a presentation at a conference itself, where it's literally the text that the speaker is delivering that is delivering the drama of the whole story in that moment. So there's no question, but rattle on about that. The way you managed to synthesize this and make, I guess, classics accessible in a fictional framework to a reader. Yeah. How many rounds did you have to go through in that respect, I guess?
Yeah, there was, for certain sections, there was so many iterations. I began to think about it a little bit, almost like I was taking this sort of niche interest that I have and wrapping it in bacon, so that, as if it were like a vegetable that most people wouldn't want to eat, and putting it in something that, everyone would want to eat, which is sort of the propulsive plot and the desire, competing desires, and, the thriller angle and the suspense and sabotage, the more sort of salacious elements of the novel. But because within there you have like you have Latin poetry, some of which is Latin. You have in Latin, so, you have meter, you have epigraphy, you have the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum. You have, so many. Just
again, all up my alley.
Right, yeah.
That's the most. Well, he wrote this for me, obviously, and nobody else.
but not of most people's alley, and I find this stuff really, really interesting. And of course, like as you alluded to, I can trace a lot of this back to that first essay I wrote about Blake and the materiality of language, and some just enchantment with the fact that we can experience the consciousness of people who have died thousands of years ago through, writing and poetry. It's, nothing that that never ceases to amaze me. And so to some degree, I think that the book, wanted to celebrate that. And the characters are people who are also invested in that reality. Chris maybe less so than Tessa, but yeah, it's there's I'm trying to remember. There was no actual question posed to me just now, right?
Luckily, no. Just about I guess the question could be, how did you manage to? Well, what was the process like trying to bring classical and classical scholarly themes into a work of fiction like this? And I think that's the bacon that you brought up, making sure there's enough there to entice a reader, but it's still that sense of making it accessible enough that I found really impressive throughout the book. That I didn't feel it was only people at St. John's College are going to, grok what he's getting at here.
Yeah. So, I had a professor in college who I remember he told me I was writing papers and I would get so in my own head. And he was like, just think about, like, he was like, you have good ideas, but be kind to your reader. Like, just remember to be kind to your reader. And it really changed the way that I wrote in an expository manner. It made me a lot more, just aware of the person on the other side of it, because I'm the same way as a reader. Like I can go deep, but sometimes I don't want to go deep. I can read from a lot of different angles. And I think that I wanted it to be something as much as possible. I wanted the book to be something that could be read by anyone, even someone who doesn't know who Ovid was. So I was hoping to walk that line.
I think you pulled it off fantastically. Tell me about your Latin background.
Yeah,
I mean, the Latin language as opposed to anyway, go
on. So, I mean, I was sort of a Latin, I guess I call it like my Latin love affair, which started when it really started when I was in ninth grade, but at the school that I went to, they started us on Latin when we were 12. And I think I took Latin and French, and I wasn't very interested in either one of them. But when I got into ninth grade, something about it just really, really brought me in. My dad was a classicist in college. He majored in classics. He almost went down the road of being a classics professor. He ended up dropping out of a grad school program. But I began to think that I might become a classicist myself. I mean, I would, stay up late translating Virgil's Aeneid, and I found a lot of comfort in translating Latin. And like my idea of fun became translating blocks of Virgil's Aeneid into the English. And that sort of brought me into college. So I was a pretty serious student. I loved the Latin language. I was not doing Greek. And I loved to write about the poetry. And then in college, I tested into the 400 level class in my freshman year. And I went to a really small college called Williams College in Northwest Massachusetts.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And the problem I encountered there was just that I thought I might major in classics, but I hadn't I hadn't fully accounted for the fact that there was only going to be one 400 level class each semester. So I wouldn't necessarily have a lot of choice in the classes that I was taking. And I began to really gravitate towards the English classes. And so pretty soon I had stopped taking Latin classes, and I decided, not to learn Greek and not to fully major in classics. And, so that was the end of my journey. The end of my sort of official scholastic journey with Latin. But when I began to write this novel, it was sort of wish fulfillment of, living the life that I didn't get to live as a classicist. I got to go back into all the Latin that I used to do. I was retranslating Metamorphoses 1, and I was translating a lot of minor Latin poets, and learning a lot about, texts and their transmission that I hadn't learned when I was a student. So there's a lot of research that went into the novel that was like kind of fun for me as a hobbyist who got to just indulge my interest in Latin. But I never got an advanced degree. I never even got a full undergraduate degree, but I was a very serious student at a young age.
Which, to me, as long as you learn, the accreditation doesn't mean that much, unless, of course, you're going for your Oxford Doctor of Philosophy, as
Right.
Tessa does. But,
Right.
That's neither here nor there. But tell me about that process then, how you branch from that into inventing the poet who's at the center of the novel, and inventing the poems, some of which are, well, go into that.
Yeah. The fictional poet was there from really early on. There was this fictional poet in the first version of this novel I was writing with the three young adults in New York. Yeah. Tessa was researching this mysterious choliambic poet named Marius. And so that was kind of there from the get-go. And I had an idea that I wanted there to be a discovery about this poet that was based off of the material remains of this human being. I don't want to give too much away from the novel.
No spoilers in this one. We're going to assiduously avoid giving away any of the fun stuff. So.
But that again, I'm sure this, maybe my therapist can explain why I wanted that to be the case. But, it does also go back to this, this essay I'd written about Blake, and this just sort of interest in the materiality of language and how these things intersect with one another. But that was sort of in the back of my mind. And as we talked about iterating on this, there's this section that takes place in Italy, and there's this fictional poet. And in the first draft of the book, the Chris and Tessa struggle made a lot of sense on the page. Like it was working. It had energy. Readers could connect with it. And then there was this fictional poet Marius, who Tessa was researching and maybe going to go on a trip to understand more about. And all of my early readers were just like, what is this? Just like, this has no
this is the
place
thing
in
I
this
care
novel.
about.
No, yeah, exactly. And I was like, this is the whole reason I'm doing this in the first place. And they're like, no, this doesn't work. Just cut it out and just do Tessa and Chris. And so I knew that I needed to do a lot of work to get Marius to be interesting and to be real. And one of the ways, there are a number of ways that happens in the book, but one of the ways is, there are these translations of his poetry. His poetry, of course, doesn't exist. He's a made up poet. But Tessa has a student at Oxford who's a pretty talented young translator, and she also likes to just have fun with her translations. And so I used her name is Florence, to write these translations of Marius's poetry. And that for me was really fun because I got to think about, what do I love in poetry? What do I love? Roman Latin poetry in ancient Rome was often recited or sung, and it was very metrical. And I was looking to music to say, what is it about music that's catchy? What makes it catchy? Why are there certain songs that get stuck in my head? Why do I like them? So I was going through the poetry of like Gerard Manley Hopkins, which, the rhythm of which I find dazzling. And I was going through songs by Eminem and Kendrick Lamar and trying to understand, how they're using internal rhyme and assonance and how they're playing with rhythm and how they're using what the listener expects to hear in from the lyricist, and then subtly averting those expectations. And ended up writing, not a lot of poetry, only maybe, I don't know, 30 lines in total across the whole book. But that poetry became sort of a prop that could be played around with, and that could make the poet real to the reader. And that's, sort of what I was really trying to achieve with that.
Yeah. And again, I think you do a great job with it. It reminds me in parts, not with, well, with the misunderstandings of transmission and, what the facts were versus what we interpret them as. Mm-hmm. With, do you know Arcadia, Tom Stoppard's play from the early 90s?
Of course.
Okay, I never know if to me it's like canonical, but I'm always afraid that of course we all know Arcadia. So yeah, it put me in mind of bits of that, which is one of my all-time favorite pieces. So thank you very much. But yeah, it's the whole fictional construct I think works wonderfully. I was tempted early on. I'm like, should I look up whether Marius is real? Doesn't matter. I'll find out by the end whether this is, quote unquote real. It's real for the book, and that's important enough. Who's your favorite Roman poet?
I love Ovid.
Yeah.
But I also love Catullus. I love Catullus 64. Yeah, I don't know. It's really between those two. Like we have so much more of Ovid, so it's hard to compare them. And I think it says something. Yeah, I don't know. It's between those two. I can't get into
it. They won't get mad. Neither one will get mad. They're safely dead now.
There's also, there's so much that we've lost, which I hadn't fully appreciated until I was researching this novel. I mean, even like the Helvius Cinna was said to be the best among all of them, and we have like one line or something that we think can be attributed to him. So I mourn the loss of some great poetry to time and the mice and floods or whatever else destroyed it. But that's a theme that the novel's interested in as well.
Definitely. And favorite translators? Is it an area where you've got a particular, the one guy I can't stand is, not that you have to talk trash about anybody, especially if they're living, but,
Favorite, I have no idea because I've not spent as much time with, actually, that's not true. Translations to me are most interesting as almost like snapshots of the time and place in which they were being translated. So like I have so many different translations of the Metamorphoses, over the centuries. So like, I think that the Golding translation is really, really fun. But there's so much different from one another. And that's part of the fun thing about having these texts that are received at such different moments in our history and such different moments in the English language too. Like the English language was so much different then than it is now. But I'm just looking at my bookshelf to look through all of my translations to see if I have them all here.
Because we're a couple of nerds, but go on.
Yeah. I actually I just moved all of my bookshelves, so nothing is in the same place that it once was. Yeah, I'm
I
gonna.
think your Twitter picture was a stack of lobes, but
Yeah,
that's
but those translations, I have some problems with those translations.
same here. I
Yeah,
was coming at it more from the Attic Greek
yeah,
side,
yeah.
but we always had if you have to, you go with the lobes because at least I had the facing pages with the
Right.
originals. But
I like some of these bilingual editions. Like there's a Peter Green edition of Catullus that's bilingual, which I think is fantastic. It's so much fun for someone like me to have, the Latin on one side and the translation on the other, and then also the notes as well. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I wish I could give you a better answer on the translators. I don't really have favorite translators, but I do have translations that I appreciate and find fun, and I'm mostly interested in like the space between translations and what that says, those sort of refractory angles between them.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did an essay of, oh God, 10, 15 years ago now on one of my favorite lines from Anna Karenina and maybe a dozen different translations of it and how it happened that the first one that I'd read was far and above the best and how it was nice to see literal ones like the Pavir and Volokhonsky, et cetera. But
Hmm.
how Aylmer Maude managed to capture the poetry of the language, may not even have been there, maybe added poetry to the language,
Yeah.
but created this image of love that,
No, I mean,
stuck with me all these years.
it's such an interesting question because the translator almost has to make it their own. It, it's almost like sometimes um, like the relationship between the original text, and the translation is almost secondary to to the text that's produced by the translator. Like I think I'm just very radical on that. It's sort of like, people, I've been talking to people some recently about, books that are made into movies. And I will never see a movie just because I liked the book. I mean, I almost will maybe avoid the movie version, but I think it's important always for the movie version to just do its own thing.
Yeah.
It has to exist on its own, and hopefully be better than the book itself. I have a running list of movies that are better than the books.
What are
And
your top couple of them?
um, I just watched, I don't know if I stand by this, but I just watched Never Let Me Go and had a
Oh, interesting.
debate about
Yeah.
whether the movie's better than the book. Like, I think there are aspects of it that work better in the movie, but also Fight Club, I think.
I was just going to say that was the one I was going to throw out
Yeah,
there because I've tried reading the book, doesn't work, and there are problems with the movie. But oh
yeah,
my God, that might be the greatest mining job of taking a book and converting it to film that
yeah,
I've ever seen.
yeah. I think the movie version of same, but I think they're both Fincher. I think the movie version of Gone Girl is also very good, though I love Gone Girl as a book. So it's hard for me to decide. But yeah, there are a few more on that list, but I'd have to go back to it.
No, but I get where you're coming from.
Yeah,
There are instances like that where it's just this is okay, but not that the book was written as a treatment for a film, but there are certain things that can really work cinematically. The Ishiguro is an interesting choice. I like that. So, like the book, but it's the movie's very different from what the book is.
yeah.
But yeah, that's a whole separate side conversation we'll get to when the movie of The Latinist comes out, I
Well,
guess.
I hope
That's
it's better than the book. I hope it's.
yeah, my question, who are your writing influences? I mean, we talk about the Blake thing, but that's not
Yeah,
influence.
yeah.
Who are the writers you feel shaped by?
Well, for this particular book, I mean, it's when I was writing stories, I would definitely have the story that was a Karen Russell, George Saunders story, the story that
Hmm.
was a Richard Ford or John Cheever story. Like, I don't know if I've had one or two writers that are influences on everything that I've done. I have been a fan of Jennifer Egan for a long time. And so I think her writing maybe has shaped me over, the past decade that I've been writing fiction. But for this book in particular, Patricia Highsmith was a big influence. The Talented Mr. Ripley series. Gillian Flynn was to some degree an influence. A.S. Byatt's Possession was an influence.
Yeah, that was where I was hoping you were gonna go.
Yeah, that book was. I can't remember if I read it before I started writing the novel, or if I think someone just pointed out to me, like, you have to read.
Boy, this sounds a lot like Possession. Yeah,
like, you have
but in a good way.
Yeah, and I love that. I love that novel. And it's very different in tone, but it's very similar in subject matter and in a lot of its thematic concerns. And so that was definitely an influence, because I read it very quickly and loved it. And actually, in the later drafts, Rachel Cusk was a big influence. I sort of came upon Rachel Cusk, I think, in like the first month of COVID. I didn't even know who she was, even though she was already pretty popular. And
Sure.
I immediately read everything that she's published. I mean, I couldn't read anyone else for a while, because I was so obsessed with the way that she sort of depicts consciousness and with her facility for language. And I think that, in the later drafts, she had a big influence on sort of the longer meditative sections of this novel. And some of the rhythms and cadences of the internal, the internals for Tessa mostly. And yeah, I guess I also have to put The Last Samurai in there by Helen DeWitt.
God, I only got to read that like a year or so ago, and I'd had people telling me for like 15 years, Gil, you need to read this book. Yeah. They were all right.
Yeah, that was, I think I had almost finished the first draft before I read that. And it really, I almost just stopped writing it, because I was like, what's the point of...
Yeah, I know.
What's the point? It almost kind of made me feel a little bit ashamed, that, dealing with material that's also, that having any intersection with that material and dealing with it the way that the Latinist does versus the way that she does in that book. So of course couldn't be more different, but that's an amazing, amazing book.
And the idea of, I don't want to say literary competition, but there is a sense of, okay, somebody did this really, really well. It doesn't mean I can't do this, which I guess was going back to your metamorphosis into a writer, that realization that you do have to try. I guess.
Right. Yeah.
Which I never got over. So I never had the metamorphosis. I'm still, some schlub in New Jersey on a pair of microphones, but that's just me and my thing.
Well, there's always time.
So I've been telling myself.
Yeah.
And speaking of, now that you've had a debut novel, I'm going to ask the question that every novelist and writer in general hates. Do you have another book you're working on?
Yeah, I mean, again, like
don't jinx yourself.
I'm not an architect, or if I were, I would be a very bad one, and 90% of my houses would fall down before they were built. But so I have an idea, but I'm not sure it's reached the point yet where it can achieve liftoff, or where I think that it's actually can say confidently it's going to be something. But I'm really interested in the metaverse right now. Sort of like, as a writer and as someone who is interested in synthetic realities, I guess that's the way I would depict it. Synthetic realities. This sort of new manifestation of it is interesting to me. And I additionally am interested about what happens when you get the injection of capitalism into the equation, because it poses all of these questions about which reality takes priority,
Sure.
that I think are, those are questions that I can relate to personally as a writer. Like there are
And
moments as a writer where you're wondering, which reality is actually more real, or which
is
reality
valid.
is
Yeah.
valid, yeah, or takes priority in your life. And so that's just something that I'm hoping has fruitful material there.
Given well, we'll say the seminal work kicking that whole thing off, Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson, it
Mm.
it dives in pretty hard with, how wrong this can all go, especially when capital is dependent on everybody staying as plugged in as possible at all times. I think you've got a lot to work with, as far as, what I would say almost 30 years since that book came out, how we've been transformed, and what the future allegedly is going to look like.
Yeah.
But once again, that gets to that question of the things we value in modernity that aren't the same things we valued in antiquity, and what the next set of values really looks like, what the next postmodern world, I guess, as much as I hate the term postmodern.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say the the big question though that I had, it's I usually have these either or questions. So I'm wondering, would you prefer to talk about Apollo and Daphne, or MFA versus New York? Which of those is something that would make you more or less uncomfortable to discuss as far as major themes in your work and your life?
I'm happy to talk about either one. I mean, um, I think both of them are fruitful conversations, but I'll let you decide.
Well, we'll dive into the MFA versus New York.
Okay.
Now, it sounds like you came from New York, but I'm
Yeah,
not
I
100% sure.
yeah, I
Yeah.
grew up in New York City.
Okay. Went off to the Midwest to do the MFA thing.
Yeah.
Um, what that whole, essay movement, et cetera, the MFA versus New York City thing
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
around. But, what's been your experience? What do the MFA mean to you?
Hmm.
And what has been being in New York and around the publishing thing, meant?
Yeah. I mean, I I don't know all of I didn't read,
Nobody finished it.
most. Yeah, I didn't. I'm not even sure I read one full essay, only because I knew that I needed as much time and space as possible to write. And I wasn't going to get that in New York City, where it's both very expensive and there are a lot of distractions. I could never have written this novel without my MFA. And so, yeah, and I knew that when I was applying. I knew what I wanted. I knew what I needed. I needed a lot of time and space to write, and that was the most important thing for me. But everyone's different. I mean, the place that I land on this is, um, I don't really recommend, whenever anyone asks me about MFAs, I'd never recommend for them to go to a program that is not fully funded. Um, I think, like, I had a couple of people who were, deep in this debate, who were questioning why I was going to Iowa, and they were saying, why are you going to take out debt? Why are you going to, pay for this tuition? Why are you going to pay this tuition? Like, this doesn't make any economical sense. You might as well stay in New York financially. And it's like, the MFA at Iowa is fully funded. There's no tuition. And on top of that, you get a fellowship. So they actually give you money to go there. It's not a lot. It's not really enough to live on in of itself, but it certainly affords a lot of time and space for writing that you wouldn't get if you stayed in New York City. That said, if I were going to go to Iowa and have to pay $20,000 a year and also pay all my living expenses, I never would have done that. So I do think it's important to seek out the programs that actually want you to be there and are going to write a check to back that up. And yeah, that's just the shortest version of what I think is important about choosing an MFA program.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And as far as Apollo and Daphne go,
yeah,
did the reading that permeates The Latinist, was that your early thoughts on that poem, or did that section of Ovid change for you over the years? Or did it come from reading an outside essay about Apollo and Daphne?
The reading in the novel, meaning like
whether the love is ironic,
love, right.
the sense of it being really a rape story.
Yeah.
I asked because I did a show last year with Anahid Nersessian, this professor at UCLA, about Keats's odes, and she reads the ode on a Grecian urn as a rape story from beginning to end, and I'm like, wow. I did not see it like that, and you have convinced me. This is very different than what I was, looking at all these years.
Yeah.
So, I wonder the way the poems evolve for us, how your understanding, I guess, of Apollo and Daphne may have changed over the years.
Yeah. I mean, all this is something also I could talk about for a long time, but I guess it definitely changed over the years since when I first encountered it as sort of like a teenager. But I honestly, I don't remember enough about what it meant to me then for me to be able to track that accurately. Yeah. I don't remember. Those are like the dark ages for me, but I'm sure that there was a sort of grotesque fascination with it. And, you get that from the 100 lines in Ovid and from the statue by Bernini, which I never saw in person, but which I had seen images of. I never saw in person until much later in my life. But I do think, of course it's a story about rape or attempted rape. But I do think it's important that, to note, at least with my reading, that the authorial consciousness of, Ovid's is not aligned with Apollo's. And there's a sort of tongue-in-cheek mocking of Apollo, who is who many scholars have been able to link to Augustus and Augustus's cult of Apollo. And Augustus is, of course, the one who ends up, exiling Ovid. And there's a lot of, I think, subversion in Ovid's sort of tongue-in-cheek mocking of Apollo, and in the language, which is almost sort of parodying him as it is depicting his point of view. One thing I do think is missing, of course, from the Apollo and Daphne myth in Ovid's version is, Daphne's perspective. And so we don't get a lot of it. We get some of it, but not a lot of it. And so, one of the things that this novel was interested in was just, trying to imagine what does it look like for an ambitious young woman to be caught up in the Apollo character's machinations. And, what does that feel like in today's world? And so,
and
yeah.
I wish we could do a spoiler thing and talk about how well you subvert and invert everything that goes on in that, but I promise not to do that.
Yeah. We don't have to go there, but
no.
Yeah.
But you managed to use the themes of the myth and, reinterpreting of them throughout the course of the book. Like I say, in ways that are, I think, masterful and, that I believe a normal reader who is not a geek like me is going to get and be carried away by. So, so congratulations.
Thank you.
And you mentioned, pandemic reading and writing. How much of the book was done within the last 2 years? And are you one of those guys who had a very productive pandemic so far?
The whole first draft was written before the pandemic, but almost all of the editing was done during the first year of the pandemic. So I would say that my first pandemic year was quite productive. My second has been less so, but pandemics seem to be easier on writers than most people.
It's a weirdly self-selecting group of people I've recorded with who are like, yeah, it's not much different than my day-to-day life. Cartoonists also, they're just, no, I don't go out, and I'm still not going out.
Yeah. So. And I mean, I was in Brooklyn for the, March, April 2020, and obviously that was extreme, but yeah, writers spend a lot of time by themselves and continue to do that.
Gotcha. Last question. Who you're reading? Everybody hates that one because if they draw a blank, they're going to sound like they're not reading anything. But
I just read Intimacies by Katie Kitamura, which I liked a lot, and the next one is Separation, which I've heard is excellent. I also just read The Last Resort by Andrew Lipstein, which I thought was really fun as well. And yeah, I've got a few other books sort of on deck. But a lot of it is, I spent so much time reading only Oxford books. I was almost using them as like kindling for depicting Oxford. And so it's been a delight to be able to read books that are not directly related to writing The Latinist.
Was there one that particularly captured the Oxford you were trying to write about? Or was it really more of a mosaic and your own impressions from your college years?
It was more of a mosaic, but I will say that I have this weird sort of sentimental affection for this novel called Jill, which is by Philip Larkin. It was like one of the first things he wrote.
Gosh.
Yeah. It's honestly, it's not that good, but there are moments in it where you can see that this person is really talented and this is really interesting. But the novel itself is like a little bit of a mess, but for some reason my mind keeps coming back to it.
Again, we all have our weird idiosyncratic faves, which again, your novel also captures the passions that, drive a very, very narrow thing that we really, really, really care about. So, like I said, The Latinist is quite an achievement, and I'm awfully happy that we were able to sit down for a conversation. So thanks so much for coming on, man.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And that was Mark Prins. His new novel is The Latinist from W.W. Norton, out everywhere. Like I said, I enjoyed the heck out of it, and not just because of the classics and Oxford setting. Mark really, he uses all that, but he evokes the worlds that his characters live in and builds an honest-to-goodness thriller of a plot. It did help that the intellectual interests of the characters helped color and inform the emotional core of who they are and why they do what they do. But all I could say is go get The Latinist. If you're a listener of this show, this is the sort of novel you're going to dig. Now, you can check out more about Mark at his site, markprins.com, which is mark-prins.com. He's also on Twitter as Mark A. Prins and on Instagram as Mark Prins, which is Preens. There'll be links to all of that in the show and episode notes for this one. Now, if you want to support the Virtual Memories Show, tell other people about it. Let them know that there's this guy doing this podcast where he just sits down and talks to interesting writers and artists and musicians and other people every single week. You can also support the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, who you think I should record with, what movie or TV show or book or music or piece of art or theater or whatever you think I should check out and turn listeners on to. You can do that by writing to me. Send me an email, send me a letter, send me a postcard. I love postcards. I've been sending one out every day this year. It's been my weird New Year's resolution. I'm really enjoying getting postcards back from people and just knowing someone's out there and getting something in the mail is a lot nicer than, one more ping in the inbox. You can also leave a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you got a lot to say, keep that in mind and, call back and leave a second message. And let me know if it would be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. Sometimes I'd like to do that, but I would never do it without the speaker's consent. Now, if you got money to spare, don't send it to me. I mean, I'm trying to do more on my Patreon for the people who support me that way, but really, the expenses for the show are minimal. My job is treating me just fine. If you've got money to spare, you can help individuals out through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Tapatogo, and there are other crowdfunding methods you can use for that stuff. If you're looking to help institutions or foundations, you can look to your local food bank, the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, election funds, Ukraine relief funds right now. There are a lot of things we can do to try to build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.